A black judge gets blocked from entering her own court by a racist police officer. What begins as an act of hatred will soon have the cop regretting his actions. How does the judge make him face the truth? And how does he get over his prejudices? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Judge Marissa Grant made her way toward the entrance. Her heels clicked confidently against the polished marble, each step carrying the weight of 15 years on the bench. The familiar scent of freshly brewed coffee wafted from her travel mug as she nodded warmly to the regular courthouse staff. "Good morning, Judge Grant," called out Maria from the information desk, her friendly wave as much a part of the morning routine as the judge's perfectly pressed black robe draped over her arm. "Morning, Maria. Those flowers are lovely today." Judge Grant smiled, gesturing to the fresh bouquet on the desk. As she approached the security checkpoint, a uniformed officer she didn't recognize stepped directly into her path. His badge read Stevens, and his stance was rigid, almost confrontational. "Ma'am, I need to see some identification," Officer Stevens said, his tone sharp and suspicious. Judge Grant blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Excuse me? You're heading toward the restricted area. I need to verify your credentials." His eyes narrowed as he looked her up and down. "I'm Judge Marissa Grant. I preside in courtroom 3. She reached for her judicial badge, maintaining her composure despite the unexpected challenge. Stevens took the badge, turning it over in his hands with exaggerated scrutiny. "This could be anybody's. These things can be copied pretty easily these days." Heat rose in Judge Grant's cheeks, but her voice remained steady. "Officer Stevens, are you suggesting my credentials are forged?" "I'm just saying it's unusual to see a black woman." He paused, his implication hanging heavy in the air. "To see what exactly?" Judge Grant straightened her spine, her full height commanding attention. "Officer Martin," she called out, her voice carrying across the lobby. Within moments, Officer Rachel Martin hurried over, confusion evident on her face. "Yes, Your Honor?" "Please help Officer Stevens understand who I am." Judge Grant's words were measured, but her eyes never left Stevens's face. Other courthouse staff began gathering around, their expressions ranging from disbelief to dismay. Betty from the clerk's office stepped forward, her voice sharp with indignation. "Officer Stevens, this is Judge Grant. She's been presiding here for over a decade." Officer Martin's face flushed red as she turned to Stevens. "What are you doing? This is Judge Grant. She's one of our most respected judges." Stevens's face paled as the reality of his mistake became clear, but his jaw remained set in defiance. Judge Grant drew herself up to her full height, her voice carrying the weight of her authority. "Officer Stevens, your conduct is completely unacceptable. You will report to my courtroom at 2 o'clock today for a formal review of this incident." Officer Stevens shifted his weight uncomfortably, his earlier confidence crumbling as courthouse staff gathered around Judge Grant. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead as he realized the magnitude of his mistake, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. "Your Honor, I was just following standard security protocols," he stammered, his voice lacking its previous authority, cracking slightly on the last word. Officer Martin stepped closer, her face tight with anger, her shoulders squared with determination. "Standard protocols? I've worked here for years and I've never seen anyone stop any other judge like this. Not once." Stevens's mouth opened and closed, searching for words, like a fish out of water. I apologize if there was any misunderstanding." "If..." Judge Grant's voice cut through the tension like a blade, causing several onlookers to flinch. "Officer Stevens, there is no if about this situation. Your conduct was discriminatory and entirely inappropriate for an officer of the law. We both know exactly what happened here." The morning sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows, highlighting the growing crowd of onlookers. The marble floors seemed to amplify every shuffling foot and whispered comment. Stevens tugged at his collar, his face flushing red as he felt dozens of eyes boring into him. "Ma'am, Your Honor, I meant no disrespect. I was just trying to maintain security. His words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Please don't insult my intelligence with hollow excuses, Judge Grant interrupted, her voice calm but firm, carrying the weight of her years on the bench. Your actions speak far louder than your words, Officer Stevens. And right now your attempt at an apology rings particularly hollow. We both know what motivated your actions today. Officer Martin crossed her arms, her badge catching the sunlight. This kind of behavior is completely unacceptable. We don't tolerate discrimination in this courthouse, period. Stevens's eyes darted between the faces surrounding him, searching for any sign of sympathy, but finding none. The weight of judgment in their stares made his uniform feel too tight. I wasn't discriminating. I was just... You will appear in my courtroom today, Judge Grant stated, cutting off his protests with the finality of a gavel strike. We will address your misconduct formally, including the apparent bias in your actions. This is not a request. Stevens's face paled, the color draining away like water down a drain. But Your Honor, my shift... Your shift will be covered, Officer Martin interjected, her tone brooking no argument. This takes priority. I'll see to it personally. Judge Grant adjusted her robe over her arm, her dignity unwavering despite the morning's events. I expect you to be punctual, Officer Stevens. We will discuss appropriate consequences for your actions, including possible charges related to discrimination against a court official. Do not make this situation worse by being late. Stevens stood rooted to the spot, watching helplessly as Judge Grant strode past him toward her courtroom, her head held high. The gathering of courthouse staff began to disperse, many shooting disapproving glances in his direction. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, now feeling more like a spotlight on his shame. What have I done? He muttered under his breath, the weight of his actions finally sinking in like a stone in his stomach. Back at his post, Officer Stevens's stomach churned with anxiety. The morning's confrontation with Judge Grant played over and over in his mind like a bad movie he couldn't turn off. Each replay made him more nervous about the upcoming disciplinary hearing. His hands shook slightly as he checked IDs, his usual confident demeanor replaced by distraction and worry. She's going to destroy my career, he muttered under his breath, checking his watch for the 100th time that morning. When his break finally came, Stevens retreated to a quiet corner of the courthouse hallway. His fingers trembled as he dialed Jessica's number. After 2 rings, her warm voice answered. Hey honey, what's wrong? Jessica asked, immediately picking up on the tension in his breathing. Jess, I'm in trouble, Stevens said, his voice cracking. There was an incident this morning with a judge, a black judge. She's making me appear in her court for a disciplinary hearing. Slow down, Jessica replied calmly. Tell me what happened. Stevens explained the morning's events, his voice rising with frustration. And now this black judge is going to use her position to make an example out of me. Can you believe this? Jacob, Jessica's tone turned firm but gentle. Listen to yourself. Why does her being black matter? It matters because she's taking this way too personally. She's turning this into some kind of discrimination case when I was just doing my job. Were you really just doing your job? Jessica asked softly. Or did you make assumptions about her because of how she looks? Stevens fell silent, his free hand clenching into a fist. Honey, Jessica continued, the best thing you can do now is show genuine respect in that courtroom. Be humble. Accept responsibility for your actions. That's your best chance of getting through this. But Jess, no buts, Jacob. You made a mistake. Own it. Show the judge you understand what you did wrong. Your pride isn't worth your career. Stevens leaned against the wall, closing his eyes. I can't believe this is happening. Promise me you'll keep your cool in there, Jessica insisted. No attitude, no excuses, just honest respect. Can you do that? After a long pause, Stevens sighed. Yeah, I promise. Good. Call me after it's over. I love you. Love you too, he replied, ending the call. Standing alone in the hallway, Stevens straightened his uniform. Though he nodded to himself, Silently committing to follow Jessica's advice about showing respect, a bitter taste lingered in his mouth. Deep down, he still blamed Judge Grant for what he saw as an excessive reaction to a simple security check. The courthouse had grown quiet as evening settled in. Officer Jacob Stevens stood outside Judge Grant's courtroom, adjusting his uniform one last time before pushing open the heavy wooden doors. His footsteps echoed in the nearly empty chamber as he approached the front. Judge Grant sat at her bench, her posture straight and dignified. Her expression remained neutral as she watched Stevens make his way forward, though her eyes held a penetrating intensity that made him shift uncomfortably. "Officer Stevens," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the room, "I'd like you to explain your actions this morning. More specifically, why did you doubt my position as a judge?" Stevens swallowed hard, Jessica's words about staying respectful echoing in his mind. "Your Honor, I was following security protocols." "Officer Stevens," Judge Grant interrupted firmly, "I asked about your doubts, not about protocols. Why did you find it so difficult to believe I could be a judge?" Stevens's hands clenched at his sides. The memory he'd tried so hard to suppress came rushing back, making his voice shake. 3 years ago, he started, his throat tightening. "My wife Jessica was pregnant with our first child." He paused, struggling to maintain his composure. "We were walking home one night when a black man attacked us. He wanted money, but I tried to stop him. In the struggle, my wife..." His voice cracked. "She was pushed down. We lost the baby." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Grant's expression softened slightly, but her gaze remained steady. "Since then," Stevens continued, his voice hardening, "I've had trouble trusting... every time you see a black person, you see your attacker." Judge Grant finished for him, her tone measured. "You've allowed one terrible incident to color your view of an entire community." Stevens's jaw tightened. "You don't understand what it's like." "I understand pain, Officer Stevens," Judge Grant cut in. "I understand loss. What I don't understand is using that pain to justify prejudice and abuse of power. Your trauma doesn't give you the right to discriminate against others." Stevens stood silent, his face flushed. "This case isn't solely about your personal pain," Judge Grant continued. "It's about how you've chosen to weaponize that pain against innocent people. About how you've used your position of authority to express prejudice rather than protect and serve all citizens equally." She straightened in her chair, folding her hands on the bench. "I will deliver my decision regarding your misconduct tomorrow morning. You're dismissed." Stevens stood rooted to the spot, his mind spinning with conflicting emotions. Anger, shame, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty about his own actions. The next morning, sun filtered through the high courthouse windows as Judge Grant took her place at the bench. Her black robe settled around her as she arranged her papers, her movements deliberate and measured. The courtroom was nearly empty, save for a few court officials and Officer Stevens, who stood rigidly at attention before her. Stevens's face was pale, his uniform crisp, but his posture betraying his anxiety. His fingers drummed against his thigh as he waited for Judge Grant to speak. "Officer Stevens," she began, her voice clear and steady, "your actions yesterday morning demonstrated a concerning bias that has no place in our justice system. When you stopped me at the courthouse entrance, you didn't just question my identity, you questioned my right to exist in this position because of my race." Stevens shifted his weight, opening his mouth to speak, but Judge Grant held up her hand. "As a police officer, you carry tremendous responsibility. Your badge represents protection and justice for all citizens, regardless of their skin color. Your personal trauma, while deeply unfortunate, cannot justify discriminatory behavior toward an entire community." "Your Honor," Stevens interjected, his voice strained, "my family suffered greatly after that incident. My wife..." "Officer Stevens," Judge Grant cut him off firmly, "I understand your pain, but using that pain to fuel prejudice against innocent people makes you no better than the individual who hurt your family. You've taken one person's actions and used them to judge countless others who share nothing with your attacker, except the color of their skin." Stevens's jaw clenched, his face flushing red. "After careful consideration, Judge Grant continued. I am suspending you from active duty for 6 months. She paused as Stevens's face drained of color. Additionally, you will complete 500 hours of community service at the East Side Community Center, a Black-led nonprofit organization serving our local community. Stevens's hands balled into fists at his sides. Your Honor, please. This isn't meant as punishment alone, Officer Stevens. It's an opportunity for growth and understanding. You'll begin your service next Monday at 9 a.m. sharp. The center director has already been notified. Judge Grant's gaze remained steady as she observed Stevens's mounting anger. This court stands adjourned. As Stevens turned to leave, his movements were stiff with barely contained fury. His eyes, dark with resentment, briefly met Judge Grant's before he pushed through the courtroom doors, letting them slam behind him. The front door clicked shut behind Stevens as he entered his home that evening. The weight of his suspension and upcoming community service pressed heavily on his shoulders. In the kitchen, Jessica was preparing dinner, the smell of pot roast filling the air. She turned to him, her eyes full of concern. How did it go? She asked softly, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Stevens slumped into a kitchen chair. 6-month suspension and community service at some Black community center. His voice was bitter, hands clenching and unclenching on the table. Jessica sat beside him, placing her hand over his. Maybe this isn't entirely a bad thing, Jake. Sometimes the hardest experiences can teach us the most. What's there to learn? He snapped, then immediately regretted his tone when he saw Jessica flinch. I'm sorry, honey. I feel like she's trying to humiliate me. Or maybe she's trying to help you see things differently, Jessica suggested gently. Remember what we talked about? About letting go of the anger? Monday morning arrived too quickly. Stevens stood outside the Unity Center, a modest brick building with colorful murals decorating its walls. His stomach churned as he pushed open the glass doors, immediately aware of the curious glances from staff members and volunteers. The reception area was bright and welcoming, with motivational posters and children's artwork covering the walls. Still, Stevens felt like an intruder, his police uniform replaced by civilian clothes, making him feel exposed and vulnerable. Officer Stevens, a warm voice called out. Mr. Anthony Harris approached with an extended hand and a genuine smile. He was tall and distinguished-looking, dressed professionally in a button-down shirt and slacks. Welcome to the Unity Center. We're glad to have you join us. Stevens shook his hand reluctantly, surprised by the sincere welcome. Thank you, sir. Let me show you around and get you started, Mr. Harris said, leading him through the facility. We'll have you helping with meal prep this morning, then some general cleanup. Later, you can assist with our after-school program. As they walked, Stevens noticed the staff members they passed nodded politely, some even offering friendly smiles. It wasn't the hostile reception he'd expected, and that unsettled him even more. Throughout the morning, Stevens kept to himself, mechanically chopping vegetables in the kitchen and wiping down tables. He avoided eye contact with the Black staff members and volunteers, focusing solely on his tasks. Yet he couldn't help noticing how everyone treated him with courtesy and respect, even when he remained cold and distant. By the end of his first day, Stevens was physically and emotionally drained. As he walked to his car, his jaw was set in determination. He would do what was required, nothing more. He'd show up, do his hours, and leave. Judge Grant might have forced him into this situation, but she couldn't force him to change his mind about these people. The days at the community center blurred together for Stevens as he settled into a routine that felt like a prison sentence. Each morning, he'd arrive precisely at 8, grab his cleaning supplies, and begin his tasks with mechanical precision. The sound of children's laughter and animated conversations echoed through the halls, but Stevens kept his head down, focusing on mopping floors and wiping windows. Mr. Harris would often appear beside him, offering a warm smile and gentle conversation. "Beautiful day, isn't it, Jacob?" he'd say, or, "The kids really appreciated how clean you got those tables yesterday." Stevens would respond with short nods or mumbled acknowledgments, suspicious of the director's persistent kindness. In his mind, these attempts at friendship were nothing more than patronizing gestures designed to make him feel small. During lunch breaks, Stevens sat alone in the corner of the staff room, watching as others chatted and shared meals together. When volunteers would invite him to join them, he'd quickly make excuses about needing to finish work. Their disappointed faces only fueled his conviction that they were mocking him behind his back. As he scrubbed tables and organized supply closets, his thoughts constantly returned to Judge Grant. The more time he spent at the center, the more his anger toward her grew. "She thinks she's teaching me a lesson," he muttered to himself one afternoon while sorting donated clothes, "trying to show me how wrong I was about her kind." Mr. Harris noticed Stevens' isolation and made regular attempts to draw him out. One morning, as Stevens organized books in the small library, Mr. Harris approached with a photo album. "You know, this center started with just 5 volunteers and a dream," he began, showing pictures of the building's early days. But Stevens barely glanced at the images, muttering something about needing to finish his work. During his drives home, Stevens' mind would race with thoughts of revenge. Perhaps he could find something in Judge Grant's past to discredit her, or maybe he could file a complaint about unfair treatment. The ideas grew more elaborate each day, feeding his sense of injustice. The community members' continued kindness only seemed to make things worse. When elderly Mrs. Johnson brought homemade cookies for the staff, including a plate specifically for him, Stevens saw it as an attempt to shame him. When young volunteers greeted him enthusiastically each morning, he interpreted their friendliness as mockery. By the end of each day, Stevens would leave the center with his jaw clenched and his mind filled with schemes. He was determined to show Judge Grant that her attempt to humble him had backfired. As he drove home each evening, his fingers would grip the steering wheel tighter, his resolve strengthening to find a way to make her pay for what she'd done to him. One later afternoon, as Stevens finished wiping down the last table in the cafeteria, Mr. Harris approached him with his characteristic warm smile. "Jacob, we're having a little celebration tonight, nothing fancy, just some food and music to thank our volunteers. Would you join us?" Stevens' first instinct was to refuse, but something in Mr. Harris's genuine invitation made him hesitate. I should probably head home." "Just for a little while," Mr. Harris encouraged. "Mrs. Johnson made her famous sweet potato pie." Stevens found himself staying, hanging back near the wall as families began arriving with covered dishes and bright smiles. The cafeteria slowly filled with the sounds of laughter and casual conversation. Children darted between tables while parents chatted, sharing stories and jokes. From his corner, Stevens watched as Mr. Harris helped an elderly woman carry her heavy casserole dish. A teenage volunteer rushed forward to hold the door for a mother struggling with a baby carrier. Small acts of kindness seemed to flow naturally among these people he'd spent weeks avoiding. A little girl, no more than 7, approached his corner with a paper plate of cookies. "Thank you for making our tables so clean," she said simply, offering him a cookie before skipping away. Stevens stood frozen, the simple gesture catching him off guard. As music played softly in the background, he observed a group of teenagers helping younger children with craft projects. Their patient guidance reminded him of his own childhood mentors. For a brief moment, the walls he'd built began to crack, and he felt a flicker of doubt about his long-held beliefs. But when he arrived home later that evening, he found Jessica sitting on their bed, tears streaming down her face as she held an old ultrasound photo. "I was just thinking about what we lost," she whispered. Stevens sat beside her, pulling her close as she sobbed into his shoulder. The weight of their shared grief pressed down on him, and his earlier moments of connection at the center evaporated. In their place, his familiar anger toward Judge Grant resurged, stronger than before. As he held his crying wife, his jaw clenched with renewed determination. Every tear Jessica shed seemed to justify his hatred, every sob reinforcing his conviction that Judge Grant's punishment was an unforgivable slight. His brief glimpse of humanity at the center disappeared beneath waves of resurging resentment. Stroking Jessica's hair, Stevens silently strengthened his resolve. Judge Grant would pay for forcing him to spend time among these people while his wife suffered at home. His determination to exact revenge burned brighter than ever, fueled by Jessica's pain and his own rekindled anger. 6 months of his suspension passed like this, and the day finally arrived. The morning sun cast long shadows across the police precinct as Officer Stevens stood before Captain Richards, receiving his badge and service weapon. His fingers closed around the familiar weight of his badge, a motion that should have brought relief but instead fueled his simmering anger. "Welcome back, Stevens," Captain Richards said, sliding the paperwork across his desk. "Hope the time off gave you some perspective." Stevens managed a polite nod, keeping his expression carefully neutral. "Yes, sir. Ready to get back to work." Throughout the morning, fellow officers passed by his desk with brief waves or quick welcome backs. Their casual greetings suggested they either didn't know about his punishment or didn't care. Stevens preferred it that way. Less explaining, fewer questions. By mid-morning, Stevens had positioned his patrol car strategically near the courthouse. From his vantage point, he had a clear view of the employee parking lot where Judge Grant's silver Lexus sat in its reserved spot. He jotted down notes in a small notebook, recording the times she emerged for lunch, which entrance she used, and who typically accompanied her. The afternoon stretched on as Stevens maintained his surveillance, noting that Judge Grant usually left the courthouse between 5:30 and 6 p.m. She typically walked to her car alone, her heels clicking against the pavement as she checked her phone. Stevens observed her preferred route home: main streets, no shortcuts, always stopping at the same traffic lights. When darkness fell, Stevens drove home with his notebook full of observations. In his study, he uncapped a marker and began writing on his whiteboard. He created sections: schedule, routes, security gaps. Under each heading, he listed potential ways to make Judge Grant feel unsafe. Anonymous letters, following her car at night, leaving threatening messages. His hand moved quickly across the board, adding more details as his plan took shape. Each note represented another way to make her experience the fear and helplessness he'd felt during his suspension. Stevens stepped back, surveying his work with grim satisfaction, his fingers still gripping the marker tightly. The whiteboard filled with more ideas: times when Judge Grant was most vulnerable, places where security cameras had blind spots, methods to avoid detection. His writing became smaller as he squeezed in additional details, his obsession growing with each new addition to the plan. Later that night, the dim desk lamp cast a yellow glow across Stevens's whiteboard as he meticulously added to his plans. His handwriting grew smaller and more cramped as he filled every available space with details about Judge Grant's routine. A satisfied smile crossed his face as he imagined her fear when she'd discover her first flat tire or find her car scratched in the courthouse parking lot. "Just a taste of what you put me through," he muttered, adding another note about the courthouse's security camera blind spots. The creak of the study door made him jump. Jessica stood in the doorway, her face etched with concern. Stevens quickly flipped the whiteboard around, but not before his wife caught a glimpse of his frenzied writing. "What are you working on so late?" Jessica's voice was soft but carried an edge of worry. Stevens shuffled papers on his desk, covering his notebook. "Just organizing my patrol schedules, getting back into the swing of things, you know." Jessica stepped into the room, her eyes fixed on the reversed whiteboard. "Are you sure that's all it is? You've been different since you got your badge back." "Everything's fine," Stevens said, forcing a reassuring smile. "I learned my lesson. No more trouble." Jessica's hand unconsciously drifted to her stomach, a gesture that still haunted Stevens even years after their loss. "We can't go through anything like that again. The suspension was hard enough, but if you're planning something—" Her voice trailed off. "Honey, I promise. I'm just focused on doing my job right this time." The lie felt bitter on his tongue, but he maintained his calm facade. "The past can't be changed," Jessica said quietly. "What happened to us? Seeking revenge won't bring our baby back." Her eyes welled with tears. Stevens stood and embraced her, guilt mingling with his determination. "I know, sweetheart. Don't worry about me. I'm just getting organized for work." Jessica pulled away slightly, searching his face. "Promise me you're not going to do anything foolish. Promise me you won't risk everything we have left." "I promise," Stevens said, the words hollow in his throat. "Everything will be fine." Jessica nodded slowly, though doubt lingered in her expression. She turned and left the study, her footsteps fading down the hallway. Once alone, Stevens returned to his desk. He pulled out his notebook, flipping to a fresh page. At the top, he wrote, Phase 1 target, vehicle, and began listing the ways he could start his campaign against Judge Grant. Next morning, the sun had barely risen when Stevens positioned his patrol car in a secluded spot near the courthouse. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he watched Judge Grant's silver sedan pull into her reserved parking space. Through his windshield, he observed her collecting her briefcase and files before heading inside. Stevens's heart pounded as he waited an additional 15 minutes, ensuring she was well into her morning routine. He glanced at his watch repeatedly, fighting the urge to act too quickly. When the courthouse parking lot fell quiet, he stepped out of his car, keeping his movements casual and unhurried. The pocket knife felt heavy in his uniform pocket as he approached Judge Grant's vehicle. Stevens scanned the area one final time before crouching beside the driver's side tire. With quick, deliberate movements, he pressed the blade into the rubber, feeling satisfaction as the air hissed out. He repeated the action on the remaining 3 tires, working methodically. Standing up, Stevens pulled the knife across the pristine silver paint, creating deep scratches along both sides of the car. The screech of metal against metal made him wince, but he continued, driven by months of pent-up resentment. Each mark felt like a small victory, a step toward making her feel as powerless as she had made him feel. His heart racing with adrenaline, Stevens quickly pocketed the knife and walked away from the scene, careful to maintain a natural pace. He returned to his patrol car, which he had strategically parked with a clear view of Judge Grant's vehicle. Now came the waiting game. Hours passed as Stevens remained in his position, occasionally speaking into his radio to maintain the appearance of regular patrol duty. Finally, in the late afternoon, he spotted Judge Grant emerging from the courthouse. A smile spread across his face as she approached her car. From his vantage point, Stevens watched as Judge Grant stopped short, her normally composed demeanor faltering as she took in the damage. She circled her car slowly, examining each slashed tire and running her fingers along the deep scratches in the paint. Though her face remained largely neutral, Stevens could see the tension in her shoulders as she pulled out her phone to call for assistance. The sight of her standing there, dealing with the aftermath of his handiwork, filled Stevens with a deep sense of satisfaction. He watched as she spoke calmly into her phone, maintaining her dignity even as she waited for the tow truck to arrive. Her composure only fueled his desire to break through that careful facade with his next act of revenge. Judge Grant then started going back home, without reacting to what she just saw. The evening air felt heavy as Judge Grant's car pulled into her driveway. The events from earlier still weighed on her mind, the slashed tires, the deep scratches marring her vehicle's paint. She had tried to convince herself it was just random vandalism, perhaps bored teenagers or petty criminals looking for an easy target. But as her headlights swept across her front yard, that comforting notion evaporated. Scattered across her usually pristine lawn were fast food wrappers, crushed soda cans, and crumpled newspapers. Her stomach tightened at the sight of several black garbage bags piled high against her front door, like a grotesque welcome home gift. Judge Grant sat in her car for a long moment, her hands still gripping the steering wheel. Through the windshield, she studied the mess before her, noting how deliberately it had been arranged. This wasn't the chaotic aftermath of wind-blown trash or animals getting into garbage cans. Someone had taken time to create this display. With measured movements, she stepped out of the car, her heels crunching on discarded paper as she made her way toward her door. The streetlights cast long shadows across her yard, and she found herself scanning the darkness between houses, wondering if someone might be watching. The thought sent a chill down her spine. Judge Grant circled her property slowly, looking for any clues, footprints in the soil, distinctive items among the trash, anything that might point to the perpetrator. But whoever had done this had been careful. The garbage appeared to be a random collection from various sources, nothing that could be traced. Standing in her driveway, Judge Grant pulled out her phone and began searching for local security companies. Her finger hovered over the first listing as she considered her options. Cameras would be essential, both visible ones to deter future incidents and hidden ones to catch anyone who wasn't deterred. She made a mental note to call first thing in the morning. The quiet of the evening pressed in around her as she looked up and down her empty street. Lights glowed warmly in neighboring windows, but the street itself was deserted. A mix of emotions washed over her: frustration at this invasion of her space, anger at the attempt to intimidate her, and most of all, a steely determination not to let these acts go unchallenged. Judge Grant's jaw set firmly as she turned back toward her house. Whoever was behind this clearly wanted to shake her confidence, to make her feel vulnerable in her own home. But they had severely underestimated her resolve. Her expression hardened as she faced her trash-strewn yard, silently promising herself that she would get to the bottom of this. Judge Grant wasted no time the next morning. Her fingers moved swiftly across her phone screen as she searched for Safeguard Security's contact information. The company's reputation for excellence and discretion had made her choice easy. "This is Judge Marissa Grant," she said when the receptionist answered. "I need a camera security system installed today. It's urgent." Her voice remained steady, professional, though her free hand clenched slightly at her side. Within 3 hours, a white van bearing the Safeguard Security logo pulled into her driveway. Mike Carson, the lead technician, stepped out with a confident stride. He was a tall man with graying temples and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. "Judge Grant," he greeted her, extending his hand. "We'll get you set up with our best system. Nothing gets past these cameras." As Mike's team began their work, he walked Judge Grant through the property, pointing out optimal locations for the cameras. "We'll put infrared sensors here," he explained, gesturing to the corners of her house. "Motion detectors will cover any blind spots." Judge Grant nodded, taking mental notes. "What about my car?" she asked. "I need something discreet, but effective." Mike pulled out a small device from his toolkit. "This dash cam looks like standard equipment, but captures everything in high definition. Most people won't even notice it's there." Throughout the afternoon, Judge Grant watched the installation process closely. She asked detailed questions about each component, memorizing the location of every camera and sensor. Mike showed her how to access the security footage on her phone and computer, demonstrating the user-friendly interface. "The system stores everything for 30 days, Mike explained, pointing to the screen of her laptop. "You can flag important clips and save them indefinitely." Judge Grant's fingers moved across the keyboard, testing the system. Her expression remained neutral, but inside she felt a small measure of relief as she saw the crystal-clear images from each camera. When everything was installed, she immediately reviewed the previous night's footage. The screens showed only darkness and occasional car headlights passing by. No suspicious figures lurking in the shadows, no clear evidence of who had vandalized her property. "Everything's secure now, Judge Grant," Mike assured her as his team packed up their equipment. "The cameras are tamper-proof, and the system will alert you immediately if anyone tries to disable them." Standing in her doorway, Judge Grant watched the Safeguard Security van pull away. She held her phone in her hand, the security app already open on the screen. Though the perpetrator remained unknown, she felt more prepared now. She would review every recording, every frame if necessary, to catch whoever was targeting her. Over on the other side of the street, Officer Stevens sat in his patrol car, parked strategically in the shadows of a large oak tree near Judge Grant's neighborhood. The evening air was cool as he lifted his binoculars, scanning her property with practiced precision. A smirk crossed his face as he noticed the newly installed security cameras dotting the perimeter of her house. "Looks like someone's scared," he muttered to himself, feeling a surge of satisfaction. The cameras were high-end models, positioned carefully to cover every angle. But Stevens wasn't worried. His years in law enforcement had taught him plenty about surveillance blind spots and ways to avoid detection. He settled deeper into his seat, maintaining his watch. The street was quiet, except for the occasional passing car. Through his binoculars, he observed Judge Grant stepping out onto her front lawn. She moved with purpose, checking each camera methodically. Stevens watched as she pulled out her phone, presumably testing the system's response time. Her movements were calm and deliberate, showing no signs of the fear he hoped to instill. This irritated him slightly, but he reminded himself that his plan was working. Why else would she need all this security? What Stevens didn't realize was that while he focused on the obvious security measures, a small, inconspicuous dash cam in Judge Grant's parked car was being installed. Next day, Officer Stevens again pulled into his usual spot across the courthouse. His eyes immediately found Judge Grant's car, and a small smile tugged at his lips. The security cameras she'd installed at her home had only fueled his determination to show her that nothing could stop him. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and morning dew as he settled in to wait. Stevens waited in his car, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel as he watched the nearly empty lot. The morning was quiet, with only a few early arrivals trickling in. A maintenance worker swept debris from the sidewalk, and somewhere nearby a car horn honked in the distance. After several minutes of careful observation, he decided it was time to act. He stepped out, casually adjusting his uniform and gripping the key he'd brought specifically for this purpose, its metal cold against his palm. As he approached Judge Grant's car with measured steps, movement caught his eye. Officer Larry Jensen was walking through the lot, his familiar figure unmistakable in the morning light. Stevens's heart jumped and he quickly pulled out his phone, pretending to be absorbed in reading messages. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Morning, Stevens," Larry called out as he passed by, his boots scuffing against the pavement. Stevens nodded back, keeping his eyes fixed on his phone screen. "Morning," he replied, trying to sound casual, though his pulse raced beneath his calm exterior. He waited, counting the seconds until Larry's footsteps faded away, and the sound of the courthouse door closing echoed across the lot, the heavy thud reverberating in the quiet morning. Once alone again, Stevens moved quickly toward Judge Grant's car. His hands were steady as he dragged the key along the driver's side, creating a deep scratch in the pristine paint. The harsh scraping sound satisfied something dark inside him, sending a shiver of pleasure down his spine. He worked methodically, moving from tire to tire, puncturing each one with practiced precision. The soft hiss of escaping air was like music to his ears. The dashcam sat silently recording, its small lens capturing every detail. The determined set of his jaw, the calculated movements of his hands, and most importantly, his face clearly visible from multiple angles as he circled the car. The morning sun caught the lens, making it glint like a knowing eye. Stepping back to admire his work, Stevens felt a surge of pride. The long scratch marked the car like a scar, and all four tires sat deflated against the pavement, the rubber slowly sinking into itself. He pocketed the key and walked away, his posture relaxed and confident, boots crunching on the scattered gravel. In his mind, he'd just delivered another perfect blow in his campaign against Judge Grant, completely unaware that his actions had been caught on camera. The courthouse parking lot was nearly empty when Judge Grant approached her car that evening. Her steps faltered as she noticed the fresh damage, a deep, ugly scratch running along the side and four flat tires. She pressed her lips together, refusing to let her frustration show, even in the deserted lot. Instead of immediately calling for help, she reached for her phone and pulled up the dash cam footage. Her heart raced as she watched the morning's recording. There, clear as day, was Officer Stevens circling her car, his face perfectly captured as he deliberately damaged her property. The footage showed his calculated movements, the way he checked his surroundings, and the satisfied look on his face as he completed his act of vandalism. Judge Grant took a deep breath, steeling herself before calling the authorities. But before she could dial, she decided to leave the increasingly dark parking lot. As she drove her temporary rental car out of the lot, movement in her rearview mirror caught her attention. A black patrol car pulled up behind her, following unusually close. The car's tinted windows and obscured license plate sent a chill down her spine. Though she couldn't see the driver, she knew instinctively it was Stevens. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as the patrol car edged closer, its headlights flooding her mirrors with blinding light. The patrol car swerved aggressively, nearly clipping her bumper. Judge Grant's heart pounded as she maintained steady control of her vehicle. Her phone sat in her purse on the passenger seat, just out of reach. She didn't dare take her hands off the wheel to grab it, not with Stevens's car threatening to run her off the road. The black patrol car lurched forward again, this time coming alongside her. Judge Grant could feel her car shuddering as Stevens tried to force her toward the shoulder. She pressed the accelerator, her mind focused solely on maintaining control as the patrol car swerved dangerously close. With a burst of speed, she managed to pull ahead. In her rearview mirror, she watched as the patrol car suddenly veered sharply, spinning out of control before crashing into a roadside pole with a sickening crunch of metal. Judge Grant immediately pulled over at a safe distance, her hands shaking as she finally reached for her phone to call 911. Through her mirrors, she could see Stevens slumped over the steering wheel, motionless. Despite everything he'd done, her instinct to help kicked in, though she knew better than to approach the crashed vehicle alone. She stood by her car, watching as ambulance lights filled the darkness, and paramedics rushed to extract Stevens from the wreckage. Her expression remained composed as they loaded him onto a stretcher, but her mind was already formulating how to address this through proper legal channels. The night air was thick with tension as Judge Grant watched the paramedics work. Their movements were swift and precise as they extracted Officer Stevens from the mangled patrol car, the twisted metal groaning in protest. His face was ghostly pale, streaked with blood from a gash on his forehead, and his police uniform was torn and dirty. The flashing red and blue lights painted harsh shadows across the scene, making everything feel surreal and turning the gathering crowd of onlookers into dark silhouettes. One of the paramedics approached her, his expression grave and his gloved hands stained with blood. "He's in critical condition, Your Honor. Significant blood loss and possible internal injuries. We need to get him to Memorial Hospital right away. Every minute counts." Judge Grant nodded, her throat tight and her hands clasped together to stop their trembling. The conflict inside her was palpable. Here was a man who had deliberately harassed her, yet she couldn't simply walk away knowing he might die. Her sense of justice warred with her basic human compassion, a battle that made her heart ache. Without hesitation, she got into her car and followed the ambulance's wailing sirens through the dark streets, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. The drive gave her time to process her swirling emotions. Anger at Stevens's actions mixed with genuine concern for his life, creating a complex web of feelings she couldn't easily untangle. Every time the ambulance turned a corner, her stomach clenched with worry. At the hospital, Judge Grant approached the nurse's station, identifying herself while trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm Judge Marissa Grant, the officer they just brought in. I witnessed his accident. Is there anything I can do to help?" A doctor rushed over, looking harried, his scrubs already showing signs of a long shift. "Judge Grant, Officer Stevens needs immediate surgery. We're facing a complication. He's O negative, and our blood bank supplies are critically low. Without a transfusion, his chances aren't good." "I'm O negative," Judge Grant said quietly, surprising herself with the immediate offer, her hand unconsciously touching her arm. "I can donate. Right now." The doctor's eyebrows rose and his tired eyes widened slightly. "Your Honor, given the circumstances, are you sure? We're aware of the situation with Officer Stevens and his behavior toward you." "I'm sure," she replied firmly, though her heart was racing beneath her composed exterior. "But I'd prefer to remain anonymous. He doesn't need to know it was me. This isn't about recognition." As the nurse prepared her arm for the blood draw, swabbing it with cool antiseptic, Judge Grant sat quietly, contemplating how life could take such unexpected turns. Here she was, literally giving her blood to help the man who had terrorized her. Yet somehow it felt right, not just as a judge upholding justice, but as a human being choosing compassion over vengeance. The sharp prick of the needle reminded her that sometimes the right choice wasn't the easy one. Hours later, the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room buzzed overhead as Stevens slowly opened his eyes. His head throbbed, and every breath sent sharp pains through his chest. Through blurred vision, he made out his wife's familiar figure sitting beside his bed, her face etched with worry and relief. What happened?" His voice came out raspy and weak. She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "You were in an accident, Jake. Your patrol car crashed." She paused, her voice trembling slightly. "You lost a lot of blood. The doctors said if it wasn't for a good Samaritan who donated blood, you might not have. She couldn't finish the sentence. Stevens frowned, his foggy mind trying to piece together the events. Good Samaritan? He asked, his police instincts kicking in despite his weakened state. Who was it? Jessica shifted uncomfortably in her chair, avoiding his gaze. Jake, I need you to stay calm when I tell you this. Just tell me, he insisted, his heart monitor beeping faster. It was Judge Grant, Jessica said softly, watching his face carefully. She was there after the accident. She followed the ambulance here and donated her blood when she learned you needed it. Stevens's face contorted with disbelief and shame. No, he muttered, shaking his head slightly. That's not possible. Why would she, after everything? Because she's a better person than you gave her credit for, Jessica replied firmly. Jake, this vendetta of yours, it's brought nothing but more pain to our family. Look where it's gotten you. Her voice cracked. You could have died, and the person you've been tormenting is the one who saved your life. Stevens turned his face away from his wife, unable to bear the truth in her words. The realization that Judge Grant had shown him mercy when he had shown her none ate away at his carefully constructed justifications. His chest felt tight, but this time not from his injuries. I don't want her help, he mumbled weakly, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Jessica stood up, her patience wearing thin. Well, you got it anyway. Her blood is running through your veins right now, keeping you alive. Maybe it's time to think about what that means. Stevens lay there in silence, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a physical force. The shame was overwhelming, made worse by Judge Grant's act of compassion. He couldn't look at Jessica, couldn't face the disappointment in her eyes. His anger, which had felt so righteous just days ago, now seemed petty and destructive. The sterile hospital room became Stevens's sanctuary of reflection over the following days. Each beep of the heart monitor seemed to punctuate his thoughts as he lay there, replaying the events that had led him down such a dark path. The knowledge that Judge Grant's blood now flowed through his veins made his previous actions feel even more shameful. He stared at the ceiling, remembering how he'd meticulously planned to hurt her, only for her to turn around and save his life without hesitation. The irony wasn't lost on him. His fingers traced the IV line in his arm, wondering if this was the same vein that had received her blood. You're looking better today, Jessica said during one of her daily visits, settling into the chair beside his bed. She'd been his constant companion through his recovery, her presence both comforting and confronting. I keep thinking about what she did, Stevens admitted, his voice quiet. I spent months trying to make her life miserable, and she just helped me anyway. Jessica reached for his hand. That's who she is, Jacob. And that's who you used to be too. Someone who helped others without question. She squeezed his fingers gently. That man is still in there somewhere. The nurses came and went, checking his vitals and changing his bandages. During one visit, they informed him that he'd be discharged soon. The news should have brought relief, but instead it filled him with an urgent need to make things right. I need to talk to her, he said to Jessica later that afternoon. I need to apologize. Jessica's face softened. That's a good first step, Jake. It won't be easy, but it's the right thing to do. I don't even know how to begin, Stevens confessed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. How do you apologize for months of harassment, for letting hatred consume you so completely? You start by being honest, Jessica replied. About everything. Your pain, your mistakes, your regret. Judge Grant seems like someone who would appreciate sincerity. As the day of his discharge approached, Stevens felt a mix of anxiety and determination. The thought of facing Judge Grant made his stomach churn, but he knew he had to do it. He owed her that much and more. On his final morning in the hospital, as he changed into his regular clothes, Stevens caught his reflection in the bathroom mirror. The man staring back at him looked different somehow, humbled perhaps, or simply more aware of his own fallibility. He straightened his shirt, knowing that his next challenge would be one of the hardest he'd ever faced, admitting his wrongs and asking for forgiveness. A few days later, Stevens stood in front of the courthouse, his palms sweaty and his heart racing. The building that had once been so familiar now felt imposing and strange. He wasn't wearing his uniform today, just regular clothes that made him feel exposed and vulnerable. Walking through the main entrance, he approached the receptionist's desk. "I'd like to see Judge Grant, please. My name is Jacob Stevens." The receptionist eyed him carefully before making a call. Stevens waited, shifting his weight from one foot to another, rehearsing the words he'd practiced countless times in the hospital. After what felt like an eternity, a court officer appeared to escort him to Judge Grant's chambers. The walk down the corridor seemed longer than ever before. Each step echoed against the marble floors, matching the thundering of his heart. Finally, they reached her office door. The officer knocked and opened it, revealing Judge Grant seated behind her desk, her expression unreadable. "Officer Stevens," she said evenly, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "Please, sit." Stevens lowered himself into the chair, his throat suddenly dry. Judge Grant's calm demeanor made him even more aware of his own nervousness. He cleared his throat and began speaking. "Your Honor, He paused, gathering his courage. "I came to apologize. What I did was inexcusable. I let my past trauma poison my judgment and turn into hatred. I targeted you, harassed you, and could have caused serious harm." Judge Grant remained silent, her hands folded on her desk as she listened intently. "When I found out that you were the one who donated blood to save my life," Stevens continued, his voice thick with emotion, "I couldn't understand it. After everything I did to you, you still helped me. I don't deserve that kindness." He looked down at his hands, then forced himself to meet her gaze. "I know now how wrong I was. The prejudice I carried, the anger I held on to, it nearly destroyed me and could have hurt you. I can't take back what I did, but I want you to know how deeply sorry I am." Judge Grant studied him for a moment before speaking. "If our blood can flow together, then our communities can live together," she said softly, extending her hand across the desk. Stevens stared at her outstretched hand, momentarily stunned by the gesture. With trembling fingers, he reached out and clasped it, feeling overwhelming gratitude wash over him. In that simple handshake, he felt the weight of his hatred finally begin to lift. Weeks after his apology to Judge Grant, Stevens found himself walking through the familiar doors of the community center, this time not as someone serving a punishment, but as a willing volunteer. The change in his demeanor was evident to everyone, especially Mr. Harris, who greeted him with genuine warmth. "Good to see you back, Jacob," Mr. Harris said, clapping him on the shoulder. "The kids have been asking about you." Stevens smiled, remembering how he'd initially avoided these same children. Now their enthusiasm brightened his days. He helped set up tables for the afternoon activities, chatting easily with other volunteers, people he once would have shunned without a second thought. "Mr. Stevens," a young boy called out, running up to him with a basketball. "Can you help us practice today?" "Sure thing, Marcus," Stevens replied, following the excited child to the court where other kids were gathering. As Stevens organized the children into teams, teaching them basic basketball skills, he didn't notice Judge Grant quietly entering the center. She stood near the entrance, observing the scene before her with quiet satisfaction. Mr. Harris approached her, speaking in hushed tones. "He's been coming here 3 times a week," Mr. Harris explained. "The transformation is remarkable." Judge Grant nodded, watching Stevens patiently demonstrate a proper shooting stance to a small group of children. His face showed genuine joy as one of them successfully made a basket, high-fiving the triumphant child. After the basketball session, Stevens noticed Judge Grant's presence. He approached her, his manner respectful and at ease, a stark contrast to their previous encounters. "Your Honor," he greeted her, "I didn't expect to see you here." "I heard about your involvement with the center," she replied. "I wanted to see for myself." Stevens glanced around at the bustling activity of the center. "I never thought I'd find such purpose here. These kids, this community, they've taught me more than I could have imagined." Judge Grant smiled warmly. "Sometimes the best lessons come from unexpected places." They shared a moment of understanding, both aware of how far they'd come from that first confrontation at the courthouse. As Judge Grant prepared to leave, Stevens felt a profound sense of gratitude. He watched her walk toward the exit, realizing how her act of forgiveness had completely transformed his life. The children's voices called him back to the present, eager to continue their game. Stevens turned back to the basketball court, his heart full of purpose and hope, ready to continue building bridges in the community he now proudly served. If you enjoyed the story of Stevens, I hand-picked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.